Thank you so much. A gifted author wrote this, not to report about God and so forth. Whoever this author was lived many centuries later. The author's trying to communicate something to us. When we read the Bible as journalism, we say, how could God do it? Right? When we read it as literature, we ask ourselves, what was the author trying to communicate to us that the divine seems to act in unconscionable ways, that Abraham seems to ask in unconscionable ways? Can we imagine God setting up such a test, and can we imagine Abraham, as it were, passing the test? So when we read it as literature, the Torah just deepens and deepens and deepens to an infinite depth. So we're here at a tragic time in our history, I think, and in world history in many ways. Just clarify a few things that's happening to us. In my mind, how to think about these things in clear ways. One thing that I read from people is that Hamas committed atrocities and genocide, as it were, on October 7th, and Israel's doing the same thing. You probably heard that before as well. And when people ask me about that, I ask them, is there a difference between defeating an enemy and butchering people for the sake of butchering people? People just don't know how to put things in historical context. They don't understand, for example, the ethics of war. They've never studied the UN definition of war crimes. It is a war crime to put civilians in the way of an enemy trying to defeat you. I mean, it should be military on military. Hamas intentionally puts its civilians in the way. Israel has opened up a humanitarian corridor. They're willing for everybody to leave northern Gaza so that they can defeat Hamas, which they have an absolute moral right to do, and under any definition of ethics and political ethics and so forth. For the people to stay in harm's way is a choice, because Israel has an absolute right and moral obligation to defeat Hamas. So when people are able to flee, and there are reports, by the way, that Hamas is not allowing people to flee, the question is, why would Hamas not want civilians to flee the battlefield? There only seems to be one answer. In order to play on the heartstrings of the media, and I think much of the media, and because I read the New York Times every day and the Wall Street Journal every day, a few others, unconsciously or not, most of the stories in the New York Times play right into this. The suffering of the people of Gaza, never saying they've had ample opportunity to flee, number one. And number two, they are being used as human shields by Hamas. Perhaps they want to be used as human shields. Maybe it's voluntary. They know the effect this has on the readers of the media. So when people say, isn't it the same thing? It's actually not the same thing. But you have to have some sophistication in understanding morals to know that it's not the same thing. So here's the question. If Hamas actually wants to defeat the state of Israel in war, to free Palestine of the Jews from the river to the sea, how did that massacre help? How did that massacre help in the military goal of destroying the state of Israel? It had nothing to do with it, as you all know. It inspired an Israeli response, which they expected and knew, and then to further delegitimize Israel in the face of the world. And this game has been going on for decades. An attack intentional to kill civilians, Israeli response, delegitimation. So it's what we might call a kind of a game, a kind of a ritual, a horrific game, but it's a game. So if someone says to you, isn't Israel doing the same thing? You'll say, well, let's just review what happened. They attacked, intentionally sought out civilians to massacre for no military purpose whatsoever. Israel has announced its intent, perfectly legitimate attempt, to destroy Hamas on the field of battle. Israel has given people the opportunity to flee. They've not taken it, either because they want to be martyrs or because Hamas is forcing them to be martyrs. When you're speaking to a person who is not sophisticated in the tragedy of the human condition, the tragedy of war, and the difference between what we're going to call unnecessary slaughter of civilians, and this is going to sound quite horrible if you haven't studied warfare, the unavoidable killing of civilians when the enemy hides among civilians. There's the intentional killing of civilians, and there's unavoidable killing of civilians if the enemy hides among civilians. The UN has made it very clear. If you look at the UN, not that I have such great affection for the UN, but if you look at the UN definition of war crimes, it is a war crime for a military force to hide among civilians. I put it in an email a few weeks ago. It's not hard for you to look it up. You can just look it up. So that's one thing I hear. I want you to know how to respond. Now remember, I don't recommend arguing. You just take a deep breath and they say, it's the same thing. Say, okay, if it's the same thing, can you describe to me what happened on October 7th? Now, here's one thing. Again, I'm trying to give you a few tools tonight before I go on with my larger theory. People will say, well, it's not terrorism because one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I say, okay, so let's define these two terms. What do you mean by terrorist? If one person's terrorist and another person's freedom fighter, I say it's two different perspectives on the same act. That's fair. How do you define terrorist? Let's say they say the intentional killing of innocent civilians, meaning they're not in the military, there's no military goal achieved, in order to strike terror in the other side for some goal or simply from hatred. Some kind of asymmetrical warfare. We've suffered, so we're going to make your people suffer. Say, okay. So what you're saying is there's a moral defense of the slaughter of civilians. Just make it clear. In some wars, the intentional, unnecessary, avoidable slaughter of civilians is morally justified. Make them say it. It's not that complicated. Make them say, yes, the slaughter of innocent civilians for some kind of political or military cause is justified. I would then ask, well then, if you're calling Israel a terrorist state, what you're saying is terrorism is justified. Meaning, if terrorism is justified on one side, it's justified on the other side. And then you start to get at the real issue. Because they would say, predictably, no, it's not justified on the part of Israel, and then you're going to get to the real thing. Because Israel has no right to exist. Every argument about killing of civilians, about terrorism, if anybody disputes the idea that October 7th was terrorism with no military justification, and that what Israel doing is the same thing, what they really mean is Israel has no right to exist. So in my opinion, when you talk to somebody, very calmly lead them to say, Israel has no right to exist. If they say free Palestine from the river to the sea, Israel has no right to exist, and therefore Israelis, it is morally justifiable to slaughter every Israeli, right? And remember, in the slaughter on October 7th, they didn't make a distinction between Arab, Bedouin, Druze, Jew, Thai workers. They knew who people were. They killed everybody anyway. What we mean, free Palestine from the river to the sea, they mean kill every non-Muslim in the state of Israel. I would just prefer that people say it and not hide behind rhetoric. Get it right out there. What I say the person is, if that's your axiom, if that's what you believe, you're entitled to believe it. And that's why we have wars. That's why we have wars. So part of the history of warfare is, I bring it up all the time, if you want to study a mentality similar to Hamas, study the history of Imperial Japan when Imperial Japan invaded China. China did not have a right to exist, only as a colony for Japan. Look at the Nazi invasion of Eastern Europeans should either be destroyed, especially the Ukrainians and Russians, complete genocide. First the Jews, then everybody else. Hitler talked about Lebensraum, clear out the land for Aryans to move in, and use them only as slaves. I can describe the military goals of Imperial Japan was genocide. I can describe the military goals of Nazi Germany. It was genocide. They each had their justifications, and you would never be able to talk anybody in the Japanese high command that it was wrong. Nor could you command any Nazi that it was wrong. There's no logical argument to be made. Now, the Soviet Union had a choice. The Nazis said, you have no right to exist, you are slave people. Now, the Soviet Union could have said, well, you're right. So we'll just put our arms down and you can slaughter us because we don't have a right to exist. That was one option. The other option was fight back. So we have to be comfortable, in my mind, this is my advice to all of us as we process this, don't get too upset. It's called a war. And when you fight a war, you just need to win the war. You don't have to defend the person, try to reason with a person across from you who justifies genocide. Nazis will always be able to justify genocide. The Imperial Japanese were able to justify genocide. Hamas is able to justify genocide. There's no reasoning to be done. You say, okay, if you want to commit genocide against the people in the state of Israel, from your perspective, it's justified. From their perspective, they have the right to fight back. Is there any dispute here? Now, if they say, no, the Israelis don't have the right to fight back, which the Russian, either foreign minister or representative to the UN just said, Israel has no right to fight back because it's an illegitimate state. Say, all right, so that means there's a war on. That means there's a war on. Now, when there's a war on, we only can have one goal, and that is to win the war as much as possible. That's one thing I really recommend to us. Don't try to argue with a Nazi. Don't try to argue with someone in favor of genocide. Don't try to argue with someone who says, free Palestine from the river to the sea. Don't try to argue with them, but at least have them admit they mean genocide. Now, if they try to move away from it, I heard one person on a program say, no, I'm not against murdering the Jews. I want to get rid of apartheid. So the person said, so do you mean change some laws in Israel? And if Israel changed a few laws, then you're okay? And the person had to really think because they never thought. If apartheid is a political system, something with the Justice Department or legislature, and if they make the changes you want, and then if I recall correctly, the person said, so what changes would you want? What exact changes in Israeli law would you want? Remember, the standard case of apartheid is South Africa. I don't think as far as I recall, anybody advocated genocide of all the whites in South Africa. They're still there. I don't remember anybody calling for genocide of whites in South Africa. They asked for a change in policy. They asked for a change in the justice system. So when the African National Congress came in, they changed the laws. They didn't say slaughter every white person. And they knew exactly which laws they wanted to change. So if a person says, I'm against apartheid, say, I am too. Which exact laws would you like to change? Now, the reason they can't come up with anything is because there's no apartheid in Israel. If they mention the West Bank, it's a little more complex. And I would always say, remember when they say it's their land, I'm going to dig in and say it's disputed land. Because you can't do a soil test and find out whose land it is. And even to argue history, I don't think you're going to persuade someone either who wants to destroy the state of Israel, wants to destroy the Jewish people, wants war. You're never going to convince them. To an uneducated person who's going to really give you time, you can walk them through the question of what it means for land to be owned, the history of Palestine. It's a region, not a people. If you have some time with somebody, and there's many sources online that you can look this up, but if they're going to say it's their land, it was stolen, if they're open to reasoning, you can disprove all of that. But if they're not open to reasoning, I just say it's disputed. There's a dispute. This dispute went back to the War of 1948 when the UN partitioned the land. The other side, the Arabs, the Palestinians actually did not have an elected voice. There was no legislature. There was no head of government. So we don't actually know what the Palestinians wanted because the decisions were made for them by somebody else. If I'm wrong, please tell me. As far as I know, there's no plebiscite in Palestine to make a decision if they wanted partition or not. There were unelected leaders who made that decision. It's okay with me, but they made a decision to reject the partition and go to war. No one made the UN. I mean, the Jews wanted the UN to create a Jewish state. No one made them. That was the choice of the UN. No one made the Arabs attack Israel and reject the partition. That was their choice. Nobody made them lose that war up to a degree. That was their inefficiency as an army. They intended to murder every Jew. They didn't succeed. That's not the fault of the Jews. They didn't fight a war well. If they had fought the war better, every Jew there would have been murdered. When I read the history of the 1948 war, I'm moved beyond imagination at what the Jewish people in the land of Israel were experiencing from 1947 through 1949. That was their choice. In 1967, Israel did not ask them to mass on the borders to announce their intention to destroy the state of Israel. That was the choice of the Egyptians. No one made the Syrians bombard Israel relentlessly in the north. That was their decision. Israel had a right and an obligation to respond. Remember, once the Six-Day War was over, Israel offered to give back land for peace. They didn't want the deal. They just said, no, you can't have all of Jerusalem and you can't adjust the borders. We want all of it. That was their choice. They chose war. Now, if I were a Palestinian, I might have said, we're not going to take your peace offer. We want everything back. In fact, we actually want to destroy you. If I were a Palestinian, maybe I would say that. But then I would at least have the honesty to say, I'm choosing war. And if I choose to make war on somebody, it's reasonable that they should defend themselves and want to win that war. I went through last time the whole history of the Oslo Accords, the Y Accords, Camp David Accords. They walked away because the deal wasn't to their liking. That's their right. They can say, we don't like the deal you're offering. We choose war. Choose war. But don't blame us for fighting back. If they want to use the West Bank as a station for launching terrorist attacks, that's their choice. But then don't blame us for wanting to have a military presence there to stop you from murdering our civilians. So I'm not blaming them to make the choice to want war and destroy the Jewish people. There's no way you can evaluate these kinds of claims. There's no moral standard that everybody will agree to. I guarantee you that. There's nothing that you can appeal to where someone will say, yeah, we were wrong, so sorry. What you can say is, well, they didn't want to grant any adjustment to the ceasefire lines of 1949. They didn't want to get any of Jerusalem back, so they chose war. So choose war. Now, when we go to the modern problem with Hamas, they have made it very clear all of Israel is occupied territory. Haifa is occupied. Tel Aviv is occupied. Holon is occupied. Petah Tikva is occupied. It's all occupied. They're not making any distinction between the West Bank, the state of Israel, inside the 1949 armistice lines. That's their right. I'm saying just from a long view perspective. You want all the land. You want to murder all the Jews. No one can evaluate this. No one can tell you don't. But you're asking for a war. So people stand back and say, well, they stole their land. It's occupied. No, actually, that is way too complex. It's simply a declaration of war for any reasons they want. We own the land. You're colonists. You're settlers. Say, look, when it comes down to it, this is what I mean. If you don't want to get in all this, when it comes down to it, settler, colonist, imperialist, no legitimacy, whatever it is you're saying, you're declaring war. And anybody who says illegitimate state, imperialism, colonialism, say, okay, got it. So you add all that up, bottom line, declare war. That's what happened. That's what Hamas has stated. Get to that. Because in this level of truth that I'm trying to share, what I mean by truth is truth as facts. Not truth as a metaphysical truth that everybody's going to agree to, because that has never happened in human history. That's why wars happen. So at a very basic realpolitik way, They declared war. We, meaning Israel, Jewish people, and I think all good people everywhere, say, okay, we're fighting back. And because of the level of atrocities that you committed, it's not going to be the old game of incursion, murder 10, 20, 30 Israelis, run back, send rockets, thousands of rockets, Israel hits back, goes in, incursion. This has been going on really since the 40s. I mean, from the West Bank, from Gaza, it's been continuous since 1947. So Israel said, it's probably maybe even continue forever. But we're going to put a stop to this in a severe way. And I don't know what Israel's going to do next. What I hope happens, as I mentioned the other night, Hamas is destroyed. Very quickly, the UN, Qatar, Egypt all move in and say, you can have all the Islamic State you want, but just not militarized. Don't bring this region into war. Will that happen? I don't know. It depends on the will of the UN, the Egyptians, Qatar. Israel wants no part of this. Israel does not want to rule the Gaza Strip, I guarantee you. I hope that Gaza Strip becomes a beautiful, prosperous Middle Eastern Singapore that brings prosperity and well-being to every person who lives in the Gaza Strip. I have no animosity toward Palestinians. I have no animosity toward Gazans. I just don't want a nest of murderers living on the border of Israel who have the intention, as was stated recently in the news, we're going to do 10,000 October 7th. We're going to do 1 million October 7th. We're never going to give up till the state of Israel is destroyed. You want war? Here's your war. I don't think we can appeal to a higher moral authority, moral truth, to talk someone out of war. It's just a war. So that's one thing I want to say, to make the way we talk to other people as efficient as possible and not lose a lot of time when everything they say adds up to war. Okay? Now, let me get to my topic for tonight. When anybody ever says something is right or wrong, here's two contrary notions that I see. And it's stunning what I call the sleight of hand. On one hand, you'll see in the postmodern critical theory group who says, all truth is situated. All ethics are situated. It depends on your point of view. It depends on your class, on your race. And there's a lot of truth to that. What people think is true, what people think is right and wrong, oftentimes is rooted in their situation, their point of view. Now, a person who seeks truth, who seeks moral truth, by definition, tries to transcend where they are situated in history and in society. So I hope to be the kind of person that I don't think what is true and right is rooted in my being a white, Jewish, male, American, list all the things that I am, all my intersectionalities, and therefore I predictably think one thing or another, and I'll tell you why I don't think that's true. Because I know many people who are my age, my race, I'll call it white for now, my religion and ethnicity, called Jewish, where we think very differently from each other. So my political and moral stands are not predictable by my situation in history. There are some of you that are roughly my age, roughly my race, roughly my religion, etc., and we think very differently. So the idea that visions of right and truth are situated is false. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many disputes of people who actually, in history, are situated in a very similar way. I hope that's obvious. What I try to do is be the kind of person that wants to transcend what I would call the natural interests of, let's say, my situation, and ask myself, what is truly moral? What is truly right? What is true? So the search for morality and the search for truth means transcending your situation. Now, look how different this is from the postmodern, I'll say first pass, I'm going to call insincere diversity, equity, inclusion, is they say there's no truth, there's no moral, it all depends on your situation. Maybe so. So asking what is true and what is moral is a fool's errand. If the person says, there's no real truth, there's just viewpoints. There's no moral truth, it's just what's advantageous for your side. You can't prove that to be right or wrong. Conversation over. As I've had this conversation, I've had this conversation I'm going to guess hundreds of times ever since I taught Holocaust back 87 to 97 at USC. Most students, unreflectively, were utilitarianism. What is right and wrong is the greatest good for the greatest number, which actually is not what the word moral even means. The word moral means something right or wrong, regardless of its utility, regardless of who benefits. The word moral, right and wrong, contain regardless of utility, regardless of who benefits. So that's not what moral actually means. When someone says moral is relative society, that's called mores, because the term moral contains the idea that it transcends human interest. The postmodern crowd says there is nothing that transcends human interest, so therefore there's nothing that is moral or true. Maybe they're right. I mean, I can't look behind the screen and see, the moral truth hovering there. As we said during the high holidays, it's an existential commitment. There's no proof one way or the other. Whether truth refers to, since it's not humanly constructed, I don't have a better word than metaphysical. I mean, it's meaning beyond the empirical. So I believe the issues of right, wrong, and moral refer to something non-empirical that's not reducible to human opinions. That's what I believe. I'm called a moral realist. Another person says, no, moral just means yay for my side. Okay. There's no test. But here's what I've discovered, and this is what I want you to pay attention to. There's a sleight of hand that occurs. On one hand, they say, there's no moral truth, there's no moral right or wrong, it just is perspective, it's a social construction. Remember from the last night, I said, I have two questions for you. Do you believe that when our country ended slavery through war, passed the 14th Amendment, and in a very, very stumbling way has included more and more people into the rights and privileges of being a citizen of the United States? I think that's objectively true, especially the civil rights movement all the way into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. More and more people are included in the American promise of rights and privileges. I think that's factually true. I mean, I don't think it would be disputed. If someone disputes it, they just don't know history. I mean, they have an ideological thing. They just don't want to grant the ground. They say, yes. I say, so would you say things got better? Or is slavery equal to no slavery? Is prohibition to voting because you're black equal to prohibition to vote, to not prohibiting black people to vote? Is it all the same? Or do things get better? Okay. Really think about this. Because then you can say, what do you mean by better? Mean better in just your opinion? Or in some real way, morally real way, black should not be enslaved? And reasonably speaking, anybody over the age of 18, no matter what their race, religion, color, gender, whatever, they have the right to vote. Is that better than restricting people on the basis of race, religion, etc.? Which is better? If they say better, you say, okay, got it. So are we both moral realists? Or are you saying there's no real definition? It all depends on your perspective. So if you're a white Southerner under the Mason-Dixon line, from your viewpoint, you're right. And someone north of Mason-Dixon, it's not right. But there's no way to know. So if you were there Wednesday night, you heard a person ask their DEI officer, how do we understand this thing in Israel? And the person says, everybody has their own truth. Saying everybody has their own truth is a way of not saying what they think. Because that's a namby-pamby, meaningless statement that everybody has their own viewpoint. Obviously, everybody has their own viewpoint. Everybody has their own opinion. Obviously, everybody has their own opinion. When people say obvious things, it means they're either a very lazy thinker, don't understand morality and truth, and that's what they've been trained to say, or they're hiding. And how do you know when they're hiding? Find what they care about. And now, nearly every person who says there's no moral truth, it's all down to viewpoint, when you find something they care about, and you say, are you saying therefore? I always bring up the issues of civil rights. I said, is that just no moral truth depends on perspective, or in some way do people actually have human rights? Now, typically in such an argument, they will say, no, people actually have something called a right. You got to get them there. because that's what they really believe. The moral relativism is a way to stop thinking because it's complex. And as you know, people don't like thinking in complex ways. Once a person says, okay, people do have rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the right to vote, the right to speak, people have these rights. Now, by the way, I don't know if the critical theory DEI people think that because they like to shut down anybody who doesn't agree with them. Okay? So I actually don't believe they believe that we have equal rights under the 14th Amendment. I think the more radical critical theory people in the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, they don't really mean those words in their dictionary definition. Some do. Some people in the diversity, equity, inclusion actually mean diversity, which means as many voices as possible, including Christian fundamentalists. Equity meaning procedural justice, not forcing a vision of society on everybody that a group of socialist elites have decided. And inclusion meaning exclusion. Now, in the radical critical theory crowd, diversity, equity, inclusion mean the opposite. But there are very many well-meaning people for whom diversity, equity, inclusion mean what they mean in the dictionary definition. You just got to find out which are they. Because what happens is the radical critical theory types hide behind words, but they have their own meanings, and you find out their meanings when you look at their practices. So, for example, I've seen this on YouTube. A person goes to a school board meeting thinking that they really meant diversity, and they said, I don't believe anybody has a right to an abortion. I believe the fetus is a human life. Somebody says, I'm triggered. Now, a person says, I'm triggered, or I'm afraid. I'm afraid of that viewpoint. Your viewpoint is violent. Speech is violence. Now, I don't know where you came from. I know the difference between speech and violence. I've been talked mean to, and I've also been hit. Okay? I prefer being talked at way more than I prefer being hit, because I've been hit. Someone says speech is violence, I'm going to suspect they have no idea what they're talking about. They've never actually experienced violence. And there's such a person of weak moral character that when someone says something they don't like, they fall apart as if they've been physically assaulted. Now, some of you have actually been violently assaulted. I'm not the only one here. So I know the difference between a violent assault and words I don't like. If anybody says speech is violence, it's a ridiculous statement. Ask anybody who's ever been physically assaulted. Ask anybody. And I know some of you. Some of you have been terribly physically assaulted. There are people here tonight who have been rape victims. People have been assault victims. And you know that speech is not violence. When people say speech is violence, it means you can't talk because I feel triggered. Right? So now that's a statement. That statement is a truth. So a person says speech is violence. You say, is that true? Yes. How do you know it to be true? Can you demonstrate that it's true? They have nothing to say because they foist it on people and never try to justify it. So I believe there are statements that are true. If you said to me, Rabbi Finley, how can you demonstrate that speech is not violence? I would say, okay, stand right there in front of me. I'm going to talk to you and I'm going to hit you and you tell me if there's a difference. Now, they'll never let me do that, but I can demonstrate that speech is not violence. Okay? Now, I'll say, if you speak to me, I'm going to stand here and be chill. If you try to hit me, it's going to go a different way. Now, I hope I don't sound that I have bravado. Maybe I'm brave. Maybe I have bravado. That's not my point. Meaning, I know the difference between speech and violence. So do they. It's a rhetorical trick. So anytime someone says something that this is true, I'll say, can you demonstrate it? They can't because they've gotten away with it for too long, and that's what happens on our college campuses. So mainly for tonight. Either a person says they're a relativist and all truth is socially situated, they say it, but they don't mean it. How do you find out? Find something they care about, such as, is it just a point of view about Jews living in Palestine? Is it your point of view, my point of view, they're both equal? Or has there actually been a moral wrong, stealing the land, whatever they say? Is it just a point of view, or have the Jews actually stolen the land? No, the Jews actually stole the land. So they do believe there's a moral truth. They do believe there's true. Say, okay, so now we agree. It's not all just viewpoint. What they're saying is some viewpoints are valid and some aren't. Anytime they say it's relative to viewpoint, find what they care about, and people will admit some opinions are valid, some aren't. Some viewpoints are valid, some aren't. But I remember I had this discussion many, many years ago when I was a part-time rabbi, a community called Makom or Shalom. So Or Torah was just beginning, and I needed a little bit of income from somewhere else, and I had this discussion. And the person said, it's all viewpoint. And I said, so you mean if someone just kind of walked into the Winchell's Donut across the street there and shot a cashier for no reason, that's just wrong because it's a viewpoint? The person said, yes. I didn't believe the person. They just got put into a corner. And then I talked to this person a little bit more about their history. So it turns out that this person was part of the Students for a Democratic Society, which meant the violent overthrow of the United States government. I said, so did you propose, I had to call myself, did you propose the violent overthrow of the United States government? The person said, yes. I said, because the United States government was committing wrongs? Yes. So now we're back to my question about cashier at Winchell's. Wrong meaning what? Viewpoint? So you were willing to overthrow an elected government because it wasn't meeting your vision, which meant killing people, because you were right or it's just an opinion. So you can kill because of opinions. So then anybody can kill because of opinions. And now that I mentioned this person's past in Students for a Democratic Society, and they were confronted with the idea, yes, I'm willing to murder other people who disagree with me. I said, okay, and that's the rule for all humanity. Because if you can do it, everybody can do it, right? Every human being can murder anybody that disagrees with them because all opinions are valid. They're all equal. Person had to say, okay, that's not true. Our country should be different. And, the person gave me their claim on Students for a Democratic Society. I said, I'm not arguing with you. That's not my point here. My question is, do you believe that some viewpoints, when you get to the core of the matter, are more valid than others? And every person who says it's all opinions, it's all viewpoints, when you find what they care about, they take it back, whether they're a socialist. It's typically the critical theory socialists who say this. Typically, other people don't say that every viewpoint is valid. There's a certain group that does. But I believe, in my opinion, it's a rhetorical sleight of hand in order for other people to not feel they have a valid point of view because all points of view are valid. And then what I think has happened is a radical point of view has come in and filled the vacuum. So this is why ever since the 1980s when I taught Holocaust, if you've known me for any length of time, from 1987 following, I am a strong advocate for moral realism because I saw students in my Holocaust class that could not make a case that Nazism was wrong because there were 60 million Germans, however many Jews lived in Europe. And if they made the Germans happy and they made Jews unhappy, who's to know? Greatest good for the greatest number. Sophomores actually said this to me. They actually said this to me. The entire time I taught the course, my first sessions, I quizzed the students. Every single semester, students would say, greatest good for the greatest number. Morality is all viewpoint. There were more Germans than there were Jews, so it was morally justified. Every single semester. Now, I'd say, where'd you learn that? Now, they hadn't taken a class in college on utilitarianism. They hadn't taken a class on moral relativism. It seems as if it was just in the air, in the water system. And who are the most adamantly committed to moral relativism? Some kind of postmodernism, which means there's no possibility for truth because truth doesn't exist. That's very different from saying it's hard to find the truth to say there's nothing to find. Different from saying it's hard to find what's right and wrong and saying these words mean nothing. The Jewish kids. Here's what was happening in my mind. Jewish kids were brought up on a religion of tolerance. If you look at synagogues that I grew up in, civil rights, in a way, was equal to Judaism. Who's a Jew? You fight for civil rights. And the fight for tolerance. Be tolerant of Jews. Be tolerant of blacks. It's kind of an awful word to say, I tolerate black people. Okay, let's say I'm a horrible person, but I tolerate them. Okay, so tolerance. You know the Museum of Tolerance? What a horrible name. The Museum of Tolerance, actually, if anything, it's a museum of intolerance. Let's just name it. And that's what we're teaching is tolerance. Love your neighbor as yourself. I tolerate my neighbor. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah, anywhere in our tradition. Okay. But I remember tolerance, 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 tolerance. And if you judged anybody, you were intolerant. Now, here's what I've discovered. Jewish kids, one generation after another, were taught tolerance, which was a good word. Judgmentalism was a bad word. Maybe the worst sin you could commit was being judgmental. I began to introduce the word rational moral judgment. And what I discovered is, if I said rational moral judgment, they would say to me, you sound like a Christian fundamentalist, which was worse than a communist pedophile. Communist pedophiles we can talk about. Christian evangelical, now we're talking about serious evil. Okay. So that's another thing I discovered. The worst version of a human being is a fundamentalist Christian because they're judgmental. The best version of a human being is someone who tolerates everybody, which means they've abdicated all capacity for rational moral judgment. This is what I face every semester. And I wouldn't go on with a Holocaust course until I could establish I'm a moral realist. Murder of innocence is wrong. The Holocaust is not just history, it's a moral affront. You don't have to agree with me, but I'm not going to take that question anymore. Maybe if you remember, if you heard my teaching, a person would raise their hand and they say, but aren't all viewpoints equal? I would say, no, I'm a moral realist. I believe there's something called truth to which we should aspire. And I'm not arguing anymore. You can go to a different synagogue, find a different rabbi, but that's who I am. So if you believe all viewpoints are valid, why is mine not valid? Why do you have to talk me out of being a moral realist? If they're all valid, right? Get off my back. But they don't believe all viewpoints are valid. They believe that being a moral realist is invalid. My whole life, I've had this conversation with people who just get to know me. You sound like a fundamentalist. You're saying you're an absolutist. I said, I've never said I'm an absolutist. A moral realist is not an absolutist. Moral realist says, there's an answer to a moral question. I don't know what a moral question is exactly. I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's worth thinking about. As opposed to thinking about, I'm going to go look for a flying pink rhinoceros. I know they exist. For the rest of my life, I will hunt down flying pink rhinoceros. So they say to me, probably not worth your time because they don't exist. I said, no, but I believe they exist. Gesundheit, take your binoculars and your bird catcher and knock yourself out in Africa, looking for your flying pink rhinoceros. But that's how many people see morals and truth. It doesn't exist. Why look for it? What makes me a moral realist is I believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions, and I believe there's something called the truth, such as the actual factual history of Palestine, not what people make it up to be. And once a person is convinced of that, their inner life changes. So these people who only believe in tolerance, the sad thing is they're typically the best kids, the brightest kids, the most lovely kids. And they really want to be tolerant, but they haven't been introduced the idea of tolerating other people because your intolerance is a reflection of your prejudices. Okay, so I want to be tolerant because I'm wrong. Is that clear? I only want to become tolerant because I know my prejudices are wrong. So if I'm prejudiced against some group of people, just because they're of that race, that group, I'm wrong. That's what tolerance means. I hope that's clear. Tolerance means somebody's wrong. That tolerance is better than intolerance. Tolerance is a moral judgment. It's better than intolerance. Now, the kids had never thought about that. They just thought that making a judgment is wrong, tolerant is right. And I would say, but that's a judgment. That tolerance is better than intolerance. You've made a judgment. Just say you made a judgment. Just come out with it. You made a judgment, and you're not a Christian fundamentalist. You're just a person who thinks tolerance is wrong. It's okay. Don't break out into a sweat here. It's okay. So I would introduce, after these conversations, and I want you to be able to say it, there's something called rational moral judgment that can assess that intolerance of people for no reason other than, for example, their race, religion, etc., is wrong. They'll say, yeah, it's wrong. I say, okay, so moral judgment. It's okay, folks. Now, when you can introduce the idea to a young person, there's something called moral realism. There's something called what I'm going to call the search for truth, which begins with the facts. The tear in their soul that creates emptiness starts to heal, and they can search for what is morally right. They can search for what is true. They can find meaning. Remember Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. Once they find what is true and right, they go after it. And whatever else you're going to do with your life, you're going to go after what is true and right, and that fills your life with meaning. Hence the popularity of Viktor Frankl's book, Logotherapy. Pursue truth and justice. Pursue meaning in terms of truth and justice. That's how I would put logotherapy. Logo meaning something like the true word, as it's used in Christianity and Judaism. Now, why should we do this? Because once you can get a person to acknowledge that truth is not about viewpoints, but actually about facts, and right and wrong is not about viewpoint, there actually is right and wrong, then you get to the core of the issue. The Jews coming to Palestine was wrong. We need to undo it and kill every one of them. That's a moral judgment. I can't talk you out of your moral judgment, but don't pretend it's not a moral judgment, and that your moral judgment means war, and the other side certainly has a right to go to war. That's it. So what would you like to do next? You're behind people who declared war. They want to defend themselves. Is there anything else to talk about? Well, they're killing civilians. Are you saying it's morally wrong to kill civilians? Yes. I would say, okay, so now we can talk about war crimes. You see, there's a certain way you talk about it and say, well, actually, according to the UN, it's permissible that if somebody's putting civilians in the way of a military conflict, they've committed the war crime. Have you heard the New York Times say that? It's online. I found it in 5 minutes. I find out that it's a war crime to put civilians in the way of an advancing military in 5 minutes. It seems the New York Times reporters can't find it. So that's the kind of things you want to do. But you have to believe. I really mean you have to believe. This is my judgment. I don't know if it's judgmentalism, but it's definitely my rational moral judgment. You must believe there are better and worse answers to moral questions because secretly you already do believe it. You have to believe that the search for truth is actually a search for truth. And truth begins with facts, and then we can go to other kinds of truth. There's a factual history of the Middle East. If someone doesn't want to accept the truth, okay, then there's war. That's the answer. War or not war. I'm offering a minimal way to think about truth and morals, a minimal way to conduct a conversation, war or not war. And then we can have other kinds of questions. Now remember, you can't do this with a Nazi. You can't do it with Hamas. I have to remind you, I want you to look at what Hamas stands for. And sorry, we have to say this to people. They're anti-human rights, anti-women, anti-LGBT. It's an oppressive Sharia, brutal theocracy, no procedural justice, and they want to have their own state. I don't understand how the world benefits from a Hamas state, from the river to the sea. There's no benefit to humanity. There's no benefit to the people living under that state. I mean, if we are, I consider myself, in the political tradition, a liberal, meaning I believe in human rights, the right to vote, equal rights between men and women, no forced religion, all the things that are in our Bill of Rights. I believe them. You would think that a political liberal would not support Hamas. Isn't it kind of obvious? I got two people, democracy, human rights, etc., with an imperfect record, or no human rights, theocracy, brutalizes people that disagree, no rights for women, no free speech. Okay, it's in the Hamas charter. I mean, there's speeches online everywhere. First the Jews, then everybody. First the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. We're going to kill every single one of them. They're not hiding it. They put it online. And you say to somebody, do you actually support that? Do you want that country to exist? They say, yeah. I hate Israel and the Jews so much that I prefer to murder every one of them and to create a state that stands for everything that I'm against. I prefer that. I say, okay, at least it's clear. So my goal for tonight was to try to give a very, very clear, methodical way to talk about someone who dances between moral realism, moral relativism. Remember, they dance, and it's a lot of sleight of hand. You got to actually drive the argument forward, and then make it clear. You're choosing war. You can choose peace. Up to you. That's my goal for tonight. But I also want to say something else. I'm thinking about this. First of all, our hearts are still shredded over here. We've told a few people I want to share with you. Our daughter, Shuli, was in Canada. She had tickets to the festival, she and her boyfriend. They had tickets to the Nova Festival. And she was going to go back to Israel to go to the festival. But she was close enough, Canada to California. She said, you know what, it's my mom's birthday. I'm just going to fly down for my mom's birthday, which was October 7th. She said to us, brokenhearted, I was going to go there. But Ima, because it was your birthday, I didn't. October 7th, I was with you and not there. I want you all to know that. Something we want you all to know is during that time, our daughter Avigal went camping in the Negev in some kind of ravine somewhere. So not far from the Egyptian border, not terribly far from where these events happened. We had no phone reception for 12 hours. We couldn't find our daughter. You can imagine what we went through. Shuli called Israel and activated all her friends in the intel, and they tried to track her down. They finally walked up the hill, and there's 20 kids, and all their phones started zinging, and they answered. We had already talked to an Israeli military officer who told us to tell them, go back into the ravine, don't drive up the road to Tel Aviv. We don't know how far this is going to get. And they didn't get back up to Tel Aviv since. And as you know, that generation, the generation of our daughters, their hearts are shredded forever. We're on the phone with our daughters. We're on the phone with their friends. We're trying to provide as much counsel as we can on how you ever recover from this and not sink into despair and not to live life traumatized, either from the actual loss or just the loss of a generation's hope in peace. They realize it's a generation of perpetual war. That's what the young generation in Israel is facing. And I have to share with you, the young generation of Israeli reservists oversubscribe the reserve units. There's always a sense that, well, we're going to call the reserves and 30% don't show up. The reserve units are 130% at authorized strength. Everybody's showing up. Both of our daughters tried to get mobilized, by the way, but they had been out of the army for too long. They said, we got fresher people, let's bring on the recent veterans. So one thing that's happening is our being extremely moved by the passion and resilience of a wounded generation to defend their country, to sacrifice their lives, to defeat an intractable and evil enemy. They're moral realists now. If there were any moral relativists left in this generation, they're not any longer. They've seen evil up close. And the news we're getting is just incredible. Now, for all of us, our hearts are shredded. And then I want to make an appeal, and I mean this sincerely. Why was the state of Israel created? There's something called Torah. There's something called our traditions. It's beautiful. If you look at the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, they wanted to extinguish us. That's why Zionists went to Israel. Because other people wanted to kill us and kill our tradition and burn our Torah scrolls and burn our synagogues with the Jews in them. If you look at the early Zionists, they wanted to create a place where it was safe to be a Jew. I don't want us to get lost in this battle so much that we forget why Israel was founded, which is why I so much wanted Shanti to read her poem, and I wanted Sherry to teach Torah tonight. Let's not lose sight of why we're here. So the Shloshim of October 7th is coming up on Sunday and Monday. I'll write about that. We have to slowly get back to the new normal. We have inner lives that need to be enriched. I think I shared, I have an Israeli soldier who was taking my wisdom work classes, and he wrote me and said, can you extend the video because I'm on the front? He's on the front and wants to listen to wisdom work. Okay? That was so inspiring for me. So as a community, we have to learn the skills that I'm teaching you, but that's not at our depth. See, our depth is we love people, love our neighbor as ourselves. Gazans are our neighbors. We want to love them. We want the best for them. We don't hate them. We want them to prosper. Unfortunately, they've declared war. We want to love our fellow citizens. Unfortunately, they've said horrific things that have alerted us to anti-Semitism. We have to defend ourselves. But that can't be the essence of our lives. The essence of our lives is light and truth and love and depth. So we're going to have to stand for both as we go forward. I'll be creating more instructional videos and more Torah. I just want you to know it's a real dilemma for us because our hearts are so shredded. We're so committed to the defense. On the other hand, we can't abandon inner lives.